about messages. Okay. Today we're in the book of Matthew. We got done with the long section, chapter 24 and chapter 25, about what was going to be coming with respect to the destruction of Jerusalem, the presence of the Lord, and the end of the age. And the disciples asked Jesus 3 questions, and in a very orderly and well thought out way, Jesus responded to all 3 questions. And I'm certainly not going to get into that today. If you want, you can go back and start looking at Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, and the messages that I taught on that all the way through. I think it was 4, 5 messages, something like that. Anyway, today we are in Matthew chapter 26, and we're looking at a very difficult time in the life of Jesus' disciples. Obviously a difficult time for Jesus because he was stepping into the time where he was going to be crucified for the sins of the world. He knew what he was doing. He made it very clear it was by his purpose, his will, and he was doing it because that's why he came. He was the Lamb without spot or blemish or any other defect, and he came to fulfill the Passover so that all who would believe in him, the angel of death, would pass over. That's what our faith connecting us to him does for us. And so Jesus understood what was going on, but his disciples did not. And so all the way through this section, we see some difficult choices that the disciples made and failed at. And today we look a little bit more closely at a specific disciple. And his name was Judas. And we're going to look at Matthew chapter 26, verses 1 through 25 through the eyes of Judas. That's an important thing for us to look at because sometimes we think, we say, what motivated the man? I think it's pretty clear what motivated the man. I think Scripture tells us what motivated the man. And I think that as we look at what he did, we'll understand the stuff that is in our own flesh and the stuff that we need to be aware of so we don't get tripped up, so we don't stumble like he did. So we're looking through the eyes of Judas at the events today, so let's look at some of the events as they begin to unfold. Jesus has just gotten done teaching them about the answering those 3 questions. In fact, it makes reference to it. When Jesus had finished all these explanations, he said to his disciples, "You know that in 2 days the Passover will start and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." So right away, we know, he says, when he had finished with the explanations, Lord, when's the temple going to be destroyed? When is your visitation? And when is the end of the world? And so Jesus did all those explanations. He responded to them. And when he got done with the explanations, he said, you know that in 2 days, the Passover will start and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. He's very clear. He says, this is the Passover. And remember, the festivals were given as prophetic signs of redemption history. It wasn't just celebrations for the Jewish people. They prophesied. And the Passover was a prophecy of what needed to happen so that the sins of the world would be paid for. And Jesus was going to be the Passover lamb. So he's telling the disciples, this is the Passover where I'm going to give my life. Remember, some of these disciples were at the very beginning when John the Baptist, had looked at Jesus and he had said to his disciples and everyone around, look, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And at that moment, John understood something, or at least he was prophetically declaring it without understanding it, that Jesus would be the perfect Passover lamb whose life would be the sacrifice that would take away the sin of the world. That was the promise inherent in Jesus' life. Verses 3 to 5. Jesus says to the disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and this is going to happen. And then we get a chance to take a look behind the scenes to see how it was going to happen. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered together in the courtyard of the high priest, the one called Caiaphas, and they consulted together so that they might arrest Jesus in a deceptive way and kill him. But they kept repeating, "Not during the feast," so that there's no outcry among the people. So we see these people who are beginning to gather together that Jesus was a disruptor. There's no doubt about it. They understood he was a disruptor. They were very nervous about him. Remember, we've been studying this on Friday nights in the book of John. The 5,000, when he fed the 5,000, the people instantly said, "Let's make him a king." Boy, if anyone in Jerusalem heard that, they would have went, "Ah!" Because they understand the Romans will mobilize against that in a heartbeat. And when the Romans mobilize, that's a bad thing for the entire country. And so, but he was a disruptor in many other ways also. He came into Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. And the first thing he did is he shows up at the temple and he examines it. Next day he comes back and he drives out all the money changers and turns out all of those that's selling and buying. He upsets the temple franchise of the Sadducees. They made tons of money. They had made the house of prayer into a den of bandits, a bandit's lair. And that was a big deal. He accused the Sadducees. These were the priests of turning the house of God into a bandit's lair, which means they were robbing the people by what they were doing. And they, of course, were doing it in the temple courts, in the area where the Gentiles would normally gather for prayer, and they were driving the Gentiles out by their noise and their confusion and all of that stuff, which was absolutely opposed to the purposes of God. So Jesus had exposed the Sadducees. Then in Matthew chapter 23, he exposed the scribal scholars and the Pharisees. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees," or scribal scholars and Pharisees. And he goes after them. By the end of Matthew chapter 23, the scribal scholars and the Pharisees had no doubt wanted to kill him because he exposed them. He showed all their hypocrisies. He tied all of the damage which had been done in Judaism until that time on their shoulders. And so he was a disruptor. And people responded. Now, by the way, these guys didn't know that. Can you imagine? These were the religious leaders. They didn't get up, before Jesus showed up on the scene, they never got up and thought they'd be capable of murder. That just wouldn't happen. But Jesus forced them. What was on the inside? Remember when Jesus was first brought into the temple, and what's his name? Yeah, that guy. Anyway, he said, it might have been Hannah too. But anyway, so he would be for the exposing. He would reveal the hearts of many. He would reveal them to themselves. Okay, that there would be a revelation that would come to people about what's in their own hearts, but they'd also be showing their hearts abroad. And right now, we see these guys' hearts being exposed in a big way. They wanted to arrest him, but they wanted to do it in a deceptive way because the crowds would have rioted. So they had to do it in an underhanded way because otherwise there would have been, big problems. And so, but they said, not during the Passover, not during the feast. Why? Because, we don't need to do this. This is not, their plan was not the Passover. What was God's plan? The Passover. Whose plan was going to win? Yeah, God's plan was going to win. It was going to be the Passover, and they were going to be the instruments that would hand Jesus over to the Romans so that he might be crucified. That was baked already into God's plan. Now we just see how people in their wickedness carried it out. And how Satan aided and abetted his own destruction. So, by the way, there's an irony here. At the end of chapter 25, we see the great white throne judgment. Jesus is the judge over the entire world. And these guys presume to sit in judgment over the judge. That's a fairly large mistake. They did it. Okay. Verses 6 through 9. When Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman had an alabaster container of very expensive perfumed oil, and she came and poured it over his head while he reclined at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why has this been wasted? This oil could have been sold for a lot of money and the proceeds given to the poor." Okay, this is a pretty famous story. Shows up everywhere. It's in Bethany. It's at the home of Simon the former leper. How do we know he's a former leper? Because no one could be there if he was a leper. They would all be violating the law of Moses. So this was Simon the former leper. If he was a leper, Jesus would heal him so that they could all come into the house anyway. In any case, he's a former leper. Okay, so he's at the home of Simon the former leper. Otherwise, again, they would not be gathered around his supper table. And a woman, we know it's Mary and Martha, it's Mary, who had an alabaster container of very expensive perfume, came and she poured it over his head while he reclined at the table. Now, this is extravagant. Now, why would Mary perhaps be a little bit extravagant? Let me think. What happened just before this? Oh, the resurrection of Lazarus. Lazarus, come forth. Okay, you all know that scene. Lazarus been dead in the tomb. It's been 3 days, 4 days, and he just calls him out. Do you think her heart might be moved to have a lavish response to the one who had raised her brother from the dead? And it was a lavish response. She had they call it a vial or a jar, a pretty common little thing that you can find in, if you go to places that sell antiquities, you can find one of these little jars that are pieces of it. But it was a jar that they would put in. It said it's about a pound. Actually, the Greek word is litra, which I'd love to translate liter, but liter's about volume, not weight. And this measurement was about weight, so it's about a pound. But it was that it would be sealed, and then you normally, when you wanted it, you just break the neck off, and that's when you'd pour it out. So it was protected through a seal, but it was an investment. It was about a year's wage, we are told in the book of John. This thing was probably dowry, inheritance, something like that. It was, remember, if you could put your money on deposit with lenders, money changers and stuff, but that was risky business. And so one of the ways that the wealthy stored their finances was in making purchases such as this that they could keep and then sell later. And this one was worth about 300 denarii, which is, when you think about a denarii being the daily wage of a working person, 300 working days is about how many working days are in a year. So it's a year's wage. And that's the accusation that comes against her in John chapter 12. Wait a minute, this is worth a year's wage, 300 denarii. What in the world are you doing? And so she's really, she's pouring out a year's worth of, just think of your yearly paycheck and that you convert it into oil, an anointing oil, and you pour it over Jesus. That's what we're talking about. How much do you make a year? You pour it out. Okay. So it's extravagant spending on Jesus. And when Judas saw it, he led the criticism. Now, Matthew doesn't say it was Judas, but we know it was Judas from the book of John. In John chapter 12, verse 6, it says, "Now Judas said this." He said what? "Why was this not used for the poor?" Judas was the one who led the charge, got the other disciples to also agree with him. Now Judas said this not because the poor concerned him, but because he was a thief. And since he kept their wallet, he often stole the money that was put into it. Okay, through the eyes of Judas, this is what was going on. The other disciples, before Judas corrupted their viewpoint, saw a woman that they knew loved Jesus, Mary. They understood Mary's brother had just been raised from the dead, and Mary comes in filled with joy and love for Jesus, and she pours out this incredible sacrifice of praise over Jesus. That's through their eyes. Judas' eyes saw things a little differently. That's 300 denarii that I could have had access to. Could have paid my debts, could have done whatever. Maybe he was a gambler. Don't know why he stole the money, but he needed the money. And so through Judas' eyes, a lot of times people say, we just don't understand why Judas betrayed him. Maybe it was because of this or because of that. It was because he was a thief. Do you think that didn't have spiritual impact? In his life, good night. We're told he was a thief. And what Jesus did bothered him at a very high level. What did Jesus do? Well, when Jesus noted this, he said, "Why are you giving this woman trouble?" That's a rebuke in case you don't understand. "For she has done an honorable thing to me. You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this fragrant oil over my body, she did this to prepare me for burial. I am telling you the truth. Wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be spoken about in her memory." Okay. This is Mary. Mary has just done this awesome thing, and all of a sudden Judas attacks her viciously. I mean, she probably staggered back because of the words. Judas was a trusted disciple. He was one of the apostles. And one of the apostles was attacking her for an act of generosity and love, and that can have a physical impact. And here comes Super Jesus. And he's big S on his chest, right? And he pushes back the tormentor. Who's the tormentor? Judas. It's Judas. He comes up and bops him right in the old schnoz. Strong rebuke. Now, this is the level of rebuke. It's not quite that, hey, you're acting in the role of Satan. But it was the type of rebuke that said, why are you giving this woman trouble? Why are you harassing her? You are completely wrong. Now, here you have a man who's filled with greed, who is being rebuked by the man. Jesus is now standing in the way of his greed. Jesus has now embarrassed him in front of the whole group. I wonder why he went and betrayed Jesus. Well, human nature is such a funny thing. No, it's not. Human nature is pretty obvious. He was a thief. He was disappointed because of the fact that he could not have access to those 300 denarii, and he had been rebuked by the one that everyone in the room respected. He was humiliated. That's what was going on there. So Jesus says, quit tormenting her. She did this to prepare for my burial. Jesus, in just a short while, is going to be led off to prison. After he died, generally speaking, anybody on a cross, they didn't take time to anoint or to properly prepare them for burial. Even in Jesus' case, because we had Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea showing up, but they just showed up with enough spice to, cover Dallas. They didn't do it properly. But everywhere Jesus went for the next couple of days, the aroma went with him. He's standing in front of Pilate, and the aroma is filling the room of this amazing ointment. And it was like, it was when he was in front of the high priest, when he was, everywhere he went, this sweet smell. Wow. What a gift, what a message that Mary gave to Jesus, just in the fact that when he walked into the room, he changed the atmosphere by the sweetness of the smell. He says, by the way, just in case you're wondering, what she did is going to be proclaimed to the whole world in memory of her. And it's been fulfilled because it's in all the Gospels, and it's just, everyone knows about this story, right? Or in almost all the Gospels. She will be remembered for her honorable act down through history. Judas, however, will be remembered for something else. Immediately after this, immediately. How do you like that word, immediately? Yeah. Immediately after this, one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me so that I hand him over to you?" Then they promised him 30 silver coins. From that time, he kept looking for an appropriate opportunity to hand him over. You understand, Matthew tells the story of what happened in Bethany to let us know Judas' motivation for going to the chief priests. And the motivation was so that, it was because he was really annoyed. He had been exposed, as a hypocrite, really. And he had been rebuked publicly, and he was chagrined that he couldn't get that money, and so he was going to look for the money in a different way. I don't know why he needed the money, but he needed the money. And so now, because he couldn't get it that way, he was going to get it another way and get his revenge. So he went out immediately to the chief priests, motivated by the stinging rebuke and his own greed. This is what happened, by the way, right after the stinging rebuke. This is in Luke 22. Then Satan entered Judas, who was called Iscariot. He was numbered among the 12. He went and spoke with the chief priests and military officers about how he might hand him over to them. Through the eyes of Judas, Judas allowed his response to the stinging rebuke and to the greed in his heart. It opened up his heart to possession by a demonic entity. In this case, Satan himself. It opened him up to possession. Now, you say, well, what does that mean? Is it like Satan's wearing him like skin? And that everything he does from then on is Satan? It's not usually how it works. We still have free will. However, Satan will work a compulsion. He will go after the parts of our personalities that would stop us from going in a particular direction. When I think about demonic oppression that someone is really deep into, I think of it in these terms. Here we are, we start out as someone who has just our own issues because we have a flesh, okay? And then we have a conscience, and we have the ability to respond to God correctly or not. Many times, because of our sin nature and because of our own focus on self, we make choices which are contrary to God's will. And we will, if you think of a pristine field in front of you, and God's will is that way, and you say, I'm going to go that way. As you walk that way, it can actually feel really bad for your conscience. It can be a problem. You're pushing down the grass for the first time. It's still there to remind you that this is not a path you should be on, because it's not a path. But then the next time you make that choice, and the next time, you eventually make a path. And then what happens as we give ourselves over to that particular behavior, Satan has minions who are all too willing to help you stay on that path. And they're the paving crew to make it easier and easier for you to stay on that path. They're already working so that you don't think about things like consequences. You want to fulfill that addiction or that desire no matter what the cost. You don't think of the consequences. And then eventually they put up like if you look at the Sawgrass Expressway, you can't get off of it. It's got fences everywhere. Okay, and just imagine that you're in a section with none of the exits, because they haven't given you any exits. It's just that now you're stuck on the highway, and you can't get off. It's compulsion. And when demonic possession gets to the level of compulsion, you need deliverance, because at that particular place in time, by the way, there's such a thing as self-deliverance. You can just simply say, I've had enough, and I am repenting of this, and I reject everything that I have been involved in. And God can start that deliverance process already. Most deliverance is self-deliverance. But there are times when it's necessary to have others help you. So anyway, this is all, and what happened was Judas had been walking down a path. He had been rejecting the Messiah. He had been stealing from him. You understand, every time his hand went toward the wallet, his conscience had to be screaming. This was the Messiah's. This was to support the ministry of Messiah, and he spent it on himself, stole. And eventually, he opened up himself to that demonic intrusion, and they got his conscience battered down. So Jesus has said, hey, Passover's almost here, and we're going to end up, I'm going to be handed over. And Judas doesn't hear that. As he's sitting in Bethany, he's thinking, oh, there goes 300 denarii I could have had in the wallet. That's how hardened he was already. And so don't think that this was brand new. Judas already had demonic harassers. And all they did was they said, okay, we've opened them up wide enough right now. It's time for the chief to come in. Because Satan was going to take care of this personally. It was too important. This was the opportunity to finally see him dead. Remember, all the way back at his temptation, it had said that Satan left him after his temptation until an opportune time. This was the opportune time. He was going to show up in Judas, and he was going to make sure that Jesus was handed over and killed. He had to be careful, though, because Jesus knew stuff. If Satan had stuck with Judas a lot and the whole time, Jesus could have figured something out. Now, Jesus certainly already had figured this out. However, Satan was trying to be cagey, and so we know that he kind of left him after he went to and did his initial thing. He shows up again, but in the meantime, we will just, continue with the story. So he's watching for his opportunity. From that time on, he kept looking for an appropriate opportunity to hand him over. Now we start to understand some of Jesus' actions during that whole time. Because Judas was sitting there waiting for an opportunity. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you intend that we prepare the Passover for you to eat?" He said, "Go into the city until you meet a man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I am keeping the Passover with my disciples at your place.'" The disciples did as Jesus instructed them, and they prepared the Passover. By the way, if you're thinking to yourself, for a huge meal with that many people, it's really weird to wait until the last minute. You are absolutely right. These details were taken care of a long time in advance. If you were a pilgrim, you may have already arranged it the year before because you wanted a place to go with your family and then where to be able to do the Passover. This was a lot of arrangements. You had to go there. You had to get a lamb. You either brought one, which usually didn't happen. That's why the temple exchange was going on. Or you could buy lambs elsewhere around the property. You would get a lamb, you'd take it into wherever you were staying because you had to examine it for those days. And then you had to take it and get it slaughtered and on the day of at the temple. And then you had to take the lamb and cook him. And you roasted him with bitter herbs. Now, all of this is not a quick process. So, if you think about their day, when they were in the temple getting doing the sacrificial thing, that they couldn't arrest Jesus there. Too many people. Didn't want to do the outcry. But wow, we could really arrest him at the place that he's having his Passover meal. Hardly anyone would know about it. Or any of the other places he is during that day. There's opportunity here. And so Jesus wants to spend that last Passover with his disciples, and he gives some pretty vague directions because he was going to thwart Judas's ability to report it to the chief priests and to the Pharisees and all of the people that wanted to arrest him. He made certain no one knew. Well, he made certain that Judas did not know, and none of the other disciples were going to be available to share it with Judas because the only two that knew, according to the book of John, the book of Luke, are Peter and John. Jesus sent Peter and John instructing them, "Go and prepare the Passover for us to eat, or so that we may eat it." They were the two that were sent into the city and to make all the preparations. He told them, "Pay attention. When you've gone into the city, a man will meet you who is carrying a jar of water. Follow him to the house that he enters. Then you will tell the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I will eat the Passover with my disciples?' That man will show you a large furnished upstairs room. Prepare the Passover there." So Peter and John were given instructions, and they couldn't even say, "Well, hey, we're having Passover at so-and-so's house. See you there tonight." Because they didn't know where. All they knew was they were walking into the city, and they were going to see a man carrying a jar of water. By the way, carrying a jar of water was normally what you would see women doing. That's why he stood out. So they walk in the city, and they're going to themselves. This is some of the weirder, but Peter's thinking to himself, well, you told me to go get money out of a fish's mouth. So they walk into the place, and there's a guy with water. So they follow him to his place, and they do this whole thing, and so now they know exactly what they're doing. They're preparing the whole Passover meal. And they completed all of their preparation. All of this, again, you know what Judas saw through the eyes of Judas? Judas is going, I'm going to figure out where this is, and I'm going to tell him where it is so that tonight the whole thing gets busted wide open and Jesus is arrested because he's a bitter, angry man right now. And all of a sudden he hears the instruction with the rest of the disciples, and he's like, huh? Jerusalem's a big city. It's filled 5 times its normal size with pilgrims. There's no way he's fine. There's pilgrims hanging out of every window. They're not going to find out where they are. And I can imagine him walking around for the rest of the day going, did anybody say anything to you about where it is tonight? I mean, where are we going tonight? Do you think it's going to be at so-and-so's house, or is it going to be at so-and-so's house? Who knows? And so he was checked right there. He couldn't, boom, nothing else. He couldn't respond to anything that was going on. When evening had come, Jesus was reclining at the table with his disciples. While they were eating, he said, I am telling you the truth. One from among you will hand me over to my enemies. Because they were very distressed, each one began to ask him, it is certainly not me, Lord, is it? And this is like, now there was a lot that he already talked about. I mean, obviously he was, talking. But it says, when the evening had come, all the preparations had been made, they were reclining at the table. Now, by the way, this is a very well done carving of the scene. And it's done by the Zechariah brothers in Bethlehem. If you have like $5,000 available and you want to buy a nice size replica of that, you can order it right from Bethlehem. It would look really nice on our baptistry, don't you think? We'd have baptism and the Lord's Supper together. Okay. We need a monument sign first. And by the way, you should know that there's movement in the direction that we may actually get one day. Anyway, so the process is slow, but we're getting there. Anyway, so you can see the normal way that meals were presented in the Roman world, and the Jewish world had picked it up. They would have a table with 3 sides on it, and then the servants could serve in the center and make sure everything was taken care of as they were delivering the food. But then the disciples would sit, and anyone who was at the meal would sit around the outside. And so this is just a nice carved rendition. This one isn't nearly as nice looking, but I did put some names on it. Jesus as the host would have been in the second position. And then the 2 people on the ends were the ones most available to be able to address any needs that needed to happen. Peter, more than likely, at the end was supposed to be the one that washed everyone's feet. And he didn't do that. So, I mean, it was not good. Okay, so, by the way, we know John was in the first position because at a certain point he's able to lean back on Jesus' chest. Remember, they're dining on their left elbow. And so he was right next to Jesus. Favored position, plus also someone that would help wait on the rest of the feast. We know Judas was next to Jesus for 2 reasons. Number one, Jesus said to the disciples, we'll see it in just a moment, this is the one who is sharing the bowl with me. Well, you can see that you don't share the bowl with too many people. Okay, if Jesus is sharing a bowl that you dip bread in, there's only about 2 people that are going to be able to share it with him. If it was right in front of him, 2 other people can share. So when he said that, he's really narrowing it down. And then when he was able, it says he also dipped it and handed the piece of bread. Well, how many people do you think he can reach from right there? So we know where Judas was. And then, of course, we don't know the arrangement of the rest. There are people, you can go online on Google and you can find out the order that the rest of them are arranged. It's called guesswork. Okay. So, but there's a good argument to be made for Peter. Where he was. So we don't know for certain, but it's a pretty good argument. He had to make a motion to John to say, John, who's he talking about? Ask him. And that means Peter was across from John and, could somehow be involved in this conversation. You can also understand how Jesus talking to John, the rest of the disciples would be clueless about what was going on. Even as Jesus was confronting Judas himself, the other disciples didn't have to hear any of it, because they're so scattered around the table, which means they didn't understand what was happening. So they could be clueless. So Jesus was teaching through the meal. He was reclining at the table. John 13 and 14 are all of Jesus' teaching. I mean, at least what John recorded of what he taught at the meal, starting with the washing of the disciples' feet and the whole thing that happened with that. And as he's teaching through the meal, he begins to clearly explain the betrayal because he needed everyone to know this is not an accident. He did not want his disciples to believe he was caught unawares. This was a part of him voluntarily laying down his life for the sins of the world. And so the disciples, can you imagine, this is a pretty small group. It's 12 people. And Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. And as far as they're concerned, what? No one in their mind. They couldn't, what are you talking about? So they knew there was a 1/12 chance it was them. And so they're thinking, and so one by one they began to ask him, hey, is it me? And then he answered and said, the one who dips his hand with me in the dish, this one will hand me over. On the other hand, the Son of Man will go just as it is written concerning him, but woe to that man through whom the Son of Man is handed over. It would be good for that man if he had not been born. So Jesus is narrowing it down. They're saying, is it me? Is it me? It's me. He says, no, it's someone I'm sharing the dish with. And that means instantly it's Judas and it's John. And you think to yourself, if I was John, I'd be a little concerned right now. Okay? So he's sharing the dish with the person. Now, maybe not everyone even heard him say that. I don't know. This was Jesus giving some directions. Honestly, he was giving one last warning to Judas. Jesus had given him the place of honor at the table so he could have some interchanges with him. But just being given the place of honor is the love of the Messiah coming out toward one who was on absolutely the wrong path. He would be the one to betray Jesus, but it wouldn't be because Jesus forced him to do it. It was because Judas made the decision himself. John chapter 13 says, after Jesus said these things, he was unsettled in his spirit and bore witness to it. He said, I am telling you the very truth that one from among you will hand me over to my enemies. A little bit later, it says, then John simply leaned back upon Jesus' chest and asked him, Lord, who is it? Because Peter had said, ask him. Jesus answered, he's the one for whom I will dip this piece of bread, then I will give it to him. This is about as clear as you can get, but he's talking to John. No one else is hearing this. He's going, dip, dip, dip. You hand that over to the guest of honor when you're the host. And he handed it over to Judas. And Judas receives it without knowing that John's eyes were open and perhaps Peter's also, but those were basically the only two. He's giving one last warning. He says, this is going to happen. It's written. This is going to happen, but woe to him. It would be good for that man if he had not been born. Wow. Now, by the way, there is a theology out there called ultimate reconciliation. It means that while there is punishment that for those who have transgressed God's command, everything's going to be ultimately reconciled under Jesus Christ. And that's so attractive. Some really good people have been seduced by it. And I use the word seduced because it's clearly wrong. Why is it clearly wrong? Because if Judas was going to be ultimately reconciled and spend eternity in heaven with God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and all of God's people, it's inconceivable that Jesus could say it would be better that he wasn't born. Because to spend eternity with God and with Jesus is worth whatever it takes to get there. This verse is what puts the lie to ultimate reconciliation. Don't forget this verse. If you ever hear someone teaching this, you say, Randy told us there's a verse that says this absolutely doesn't work, or Jesus is a liar. So now you've got it planted in you. You are ultimate reconciliation proof. Then Judas, the one who was handing him over to his enemies, responded and asked, this is after he had taken the bread. Okay, had a great time. It is certainly not me, is it, Rabbi? Jesus said to him, you yourself have declared it. This is Judas keeping up appearances. If all the other disciples had asked, is it me, Judas had to say it too, because otherwise all the other disciples go, he didn't ask. What does he know, right? And so he had to ask in the same way. And this is brazen, of course, but remember, Satan was involved, working with him and doing what he can to kind of, or one of his lesser demons. We know he had possession issues at this point, and it may not have been Satan personally at this moment, but it was certainly, there was some brazenness there. And Jesus affirms, and he says, yeah, it is you. You've said it. And again, that did not have to be loud for the whole table. That just had to be between Jesus and Judas, who were right next to each other. And so the audience was limited. In the book of John, we read a little bit more about what was going on. Then after he took the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Came back. Okay, there was some business to do. Satan could not risk having Judas. Jesus had just given him the guest of honor piece. And what did Satan do? I could lose this man at this moment. And shows up in person because he's going to make sure that Judas is hardened to the point where he's able to carry through what he was intending to do. Jesus said to him, because now he sees Satan's in this man. He says, what you are doing, do as soon as possible. But none of those reclining at the table knew why he said this to him, for some assumed that since Judas kept the wallet, that Jesus was saying to him, but what we need for the feast, the rest of the feast, or that he should give something to the poor people. They just thought, man, he's going to buy more provisions because the feast went on for a day. And all of those things. Then after he had received the piece of bread, he immediately left, and it was night. Well, that's that little "and it was night." You think to yourself, yeah, John was certainly referring to the fact that the sun had gone down, but there was far more than that. It was the time when darkness reigned, and Jesus would be referring to it as time went on. Through the eyes of Judas, because Jesus hands him a piece of bread dipped in the bowl as a sign of honor. And for Judas, it became a sign of destruction because he could not receive grace from God. He refused it. And Satan got involved to make sure that there was nothing that his screaming conscience could do to stop him from making this awful decision. In the book of Acts, Peter, when he refers to Judas, he said he went to his own place. That's kind of a scary thought because we know that there's some really bad places in places of those who have rejected God. But it sounds like there's a special place, his own place. Not just the place that everyone who rejects God's go, his own place. Like there's a special place for the man who betrayed Messiah. So, we've shared the destruction of a disciple by the name of Judas today. How he saw the events that were going on. Through the eyes of the disciples, they were confused. They didn't understand. They had their own flesh issues, but they eventually were able to come out of everything that happened and to grab onto Jesus with both hands. But for a guy named Judas, that would not happen. Because he allowed himself to be used. By the way, Satan's a user. As soon as he was done with Judas, he just tossed him away. He just tossed him away. And then when Satan left him, every demon in hell was screaming at what a worthless individual he was, and he went into despair and despondency and, of course, ended his own life. That's how it works. Satan's not a good master. He will destroy. He hates human beings. He will destroy everyone when they're done being of use to him. I just thought of an application that I'm going to stay very far away from. Anyway, let's pray. Lord, thank you for the opportunity today to be able to look at these scriptures in a way that's a little disturbing, because we see the destruction of one whom you called to be an apostle. And that does not bring joy to our hearts, it brings sorrow. We are certainly pleased that there was someone who was there to help you complete your role. And yet at the same time, we understand the awful responsibility of that person and what they, in their willful, sinful way, brought on themselves. I ask, Lord, that you would use this section of Scripture to remind us of what great grace you have given us, that you have shielded us from these things. Lord, if there's anything that we've been toying with in our lives, please, please help us to step away from them. You are the lion rampant. You are the lion on the move, and we do not want to have anything in our lives that would open us up to your judgment falling. Pour out your grace on us now and always. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.